Good morning, Mexico. Good afternoon, London, and good night, India. It is a pleasure to have with us Bina Agarwal. She is going to talk about women's rights and social reproduction in post-COVID times. And she has prepared a great conference about gendering the collective managing South Asia's forests and farms. I'm very glad to have her here. She has an impressive CBU, and also she's an associate of the International Association for Feminist Economies, and we are very good friends since more than 2 or 3 decades. So I am going to introduce her because I'm going to say who is. She is Professor of Development Economics and Environment at the Global Development Institute, University of Manchester. Earlier, she was Director and Professor at the Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi. She has held distinguished positions at the University of Cambridge, Harvard, Princeton, Minnesota, and Michigan, and been President of the International Society for Ecological Economics, President of the International Association for Feminist Economics, and Vice President of the International Economic Association. In 2005, she led a successful civil society campaign to amend India's Hindu inheritance law to make it gender equal. Her publications include 13 books and 95 academic papers on subjects such as property and land rights, environment governance, and agrarian change, written especially from a political economy and gender perspective. In 2016, Oxford University Press published Gender Challenges, a 3-volume compendium of her selected papers. Among her many awards are several book prizes, a Padma Shri from the President of India in 2008, the Leon Tief Prize 2010 for advancing the frontiers of economic thought, and the International Balsam Prize 2017 for challenging established premises in economics and the social science by using an innovative gender perspective. Bina, we are very happy to have you here at UNAM, and we are very happy to have this also in London, in the Mexican Embassy, in United Kingdom, and also in Delhi. So welcome, and I give you the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Alicia. Alicia Girón is in Mexico. She's a very old friend and colleague. So thanks for inviting me. And Anna Treveno, who is in the UK, who has done a fantastic job in organizing this. And I also thank all the sponsors of this event. I want to say hello to everybody globally, and thanks especially to my Mexican colleagues and friends. So let me start by first sharing my PPT, and then we can move forward. My lecture will be on gendering the collective, managing South Asia's forests and farms. Now, the first question is, what is a collective? We can think of a collective, minimally at least, as a group of people working together for a common purpose. It could be parliaments, municipalities, village councils, could be political parties, trade unions, clubs, and cooperatives. It could be protest movements or other social movements, and so on. In fact, although we see ourselves as individuals, in fact, we are constantly interacting with and often even embedded within collectives. But collectives can be of many types. So they can be constituted for diverse purposes. Their modes of interaction can differ, as can their social composition and motivation. So if you take the issue of purpose, some collectives are mainly political, such as political parties or legislators. Others are mainly social in scope, such as clubs or reform groups. And yet others are focused on economic gains, such as trade unions or producers' cooperatives. And a few, in fact, may cover several functions. For instance, when you think of parliaments, they legislate both for economic and social policy. Secondly, collectives differ in their degree of formality. So we think of formal groups as groups that are clearly delineated and have authority, derived either from the state or some other body, and they make and enforce rules. But informal groups lack both delineation and such authority. Then the nature of collective functioning can also differ. So I make a distinction between what I call agitational collective action and cooperative collective action. So what is the difference here? So agitational action, for instance, protest groups are sporadic, and they typically are mobilized to demand action from the state, whereas cooperative collective action is much more continuous and requires regular interaction and decision making, such as in communities protecting resources or in group farming. Fourthly, some collectives, such as political parties, may have well-defined ideologies, while others may be formed simply because you have a common interest, and this interest could be centered either by gender or by race. Fifthly, collectives can vary in their social composition by gender, by caste, by class, and so on. And some are largely homogeneous on these counts, whereas others could be heterogeneous across these categories. And then, of course, collectives can have different motivations for forming you may have different motivations for participating in a collective. And this could range from quite narrow self-interest to enlightened self-interest to altruism. And one can imagine this as a dynamic process, that this level of interest could change over time, and you could move from fairly narrow self-interest to even transformative agendas. Now, these aspects of these collectives are also gendered, and especially, say, for instance, if you think of South Asia and possibly elsewhere, women tend to be located much more in informal than informal collectives, unless, of course, there are quotas. And they are much more often in all women's collectives, such as women's wings of political parties, self-help groups, or autonomous women's groups, rather than on mixed gender collectives. In mixed gender collectives, they tend to be more present in demonstrations or in agitational collective action than in cooperative collective action or decision making. So, for instance, in India, women have been involved in protests against forest logging, as in the Chipko movement, which many people would have heard about, or in the farmers movement, which is going on at present, or historically, like the peasant movements of Telangana and Tebaga for rights in land. But what is important is that although women often and frequently participate in agitational collective action, they are rarely part of the decision-making forums of these organizations. And so that's something I will come to. So if you actually look at, in a broad way, the research around collectives, especially in developing countries, you find that there has been much more focus on the low numbers in formal institutions of state governance, such as parliaments and village councils. And then there's been focus on the factors which underlie women's absence in these institutions or their low levels in these institutions. But there's been rather less attention paid to the impact of their presence. So, for instance, globally, you know that there's intense lobbying for gender quotas in parliament, including in India, with some success. But if you ask what difference has that made to outcomes for women, then research on that is rather sparse. In particular, there's little work on the impact of women's presence in collectives which are formed to manage economic resources, with the possible exception of microcredit. So today, my focus will be on two types of collectives, because this is, I feel, broadly has been a neglected area. And these are, I would call them focused on economic resources. These are forest collectives and farm collectives. So the first one relates to the community management of common property resources, in particular forests. And the second one relates to private property resources, in particular farmland. Now, in both cases, I eschew, the standard question is, why are women largely absent from formal collectives? So I move away from that question to ask, what impact do women have when they are present? So it turns the question on its head. So in this context, I will also consider questions such as what proportion of women can make a difference, what would count as a critical mass, and is there power simply in numbers, what we can term gender in itself, or do women also need to develop a collective consciousness of solidarity, what we could call gender for itself? So some of you will recognize the parallels between the Marxist distinctions between class in itself and class for itself. But at the same time, I'm not implying that women suffer from false consciousness, which has been linked to the distinction of class in itself and for itself. So let me now talk firstly of forest collectives, and then I'll talk about farm collectives. Now, forests are extremely important. They are, of course, we know that they are very important in the context of climate change, but they're also very important for most rural households in developing countries. So 1 in 6 persons globally depend on forests for items of daily need. One of the most important is fuel wood, and it accounts for 50% of wood withdrawn globally, something like 90% in Africa. And this is typically collected by women. Women also collect uncultivated food items, fodder items, and a wide variety of non-timber forest products, whereas timber is much more collected by men. And then forests, of course, provide green manure, soil, water, and so on. An interesting statistic, an estimate was made by an organization which looked at the non-marketed natural goods and ecosystem services. And according to that estimate, these account for 47% of what they call GDP of the poor in India, and something like 90% in Brazil. This is the ecosystem services group which has looked at this. It's economics of ecosystem services and biodiversity. So essentially, therefore, in most countries, forests are largely government-owned. And in India and Nepal, something like 96% of forest land is government-owned. But what we find is that in the late 1970s, when, if you will recall, the first initial satellite images began to show the huge levels of forest degradation and deforestation globally. What it pointed to was the very significant level of state failure in forest protection. So on the one side, you saw state failure, and on the other side, there was the emergence of successful protection by village communities. And we know that there were examples globally, including in not just in South Asia, but in Brazil and in many other parts of the world. So by the late 1980s, there was a growing consensus globally in favor of co-managing forests with communities. And over 50 countries actually launched co-management programs in the 1990s. Now, India and Nepal were amongst the first of these. India, for instance, launched its joint forest management program in 1990 and Nepal in 1993. And under these programs, villagers could manage tracts of degraded local forests and reap the specified benefits of regeneration. So by the early 2000s, India had an estimated 84,000 such groups protecting 22.4% of recorded forest area. And Nepal had something like 10,000 groups covering 11% of forest area. So I'll call these groups which are protecting forests, forest collectives, as community forestry groups, CFGs for short. Now, under community forestry, basically villagers were given to protect and manage degraded forests, and this was allotted to them by the state. Just to give you an idea that the management structure of these CFGs was a simple one. It was a 2-tier structure. There was a general body, in which all the village households could be members, and there was an executive committee of 9 to 15 persons. So both bodies interactively defined the rules of forest use, the forms of protection, benefit distribution, and conflict resolution. But the executive committee was the core decision-making body. And therefore, who had voice in the EC bore critically on group functioning. That is, who would gain and who would lose from them. Now, people might ask, well, what does forest protection involve? And typically, it basically involves that you restrict the entry of people and animals, and you regulate extraction. And you can do protection in a variety of ways. You can have a guard, you can have a patrol group, or do an informal lookout. Now, the executive committee makes the extraction rules. So for instance, if firewood collection is banned, it will cause great hardship to poor women because firewood, as I had noted, was a major cooking fuel and continues to be, and is largely collected by women. So if you see this picture, you see people fetching firewood, and these are from different continents. On the left, you have young girls after school in Latin America, and you have a woman in old age on the right side. And this is some village women told me that if men went to collect firewood, they would take a bullock cart, unlike women who bring headloads. So you can see the difference in technology as well. So in South Asia, women's inclusion in these mixed gender collectives was initially very limited. Most Indian states prescribed that there should be at least 2 women in each committee. Why 2? Because they said 1 woman will feel lonely. So some states later raised this prescription to 1/3 women. But in practice, most of these groups didn't follow the prescriptions. And where women were included, it was not very effective participation because they were restricted by social norms. Now, what does it mean to have voice beyond being a token member? So I have this typology of participation that you can see. Now, you can be a nominal member, simply be a member of a group, but effective or empowered participation requires more than membership. It needs that you attend meetings, you speak up at them, and you're able to influence decisions at least some of the time in your favor. In fact, if you think about it, this typology could be applied in many collectives, including in university committees, because often you can be a member, but you don't have a voice and you're not able to influence the decisions. Now, typically, women in the forest collectives were not even nominal members, and the few who were part of the EC, many of the ECs had no women, others had 1 or 2 women, and 1 or 2 women in among 11 to 15 men were not very effective. Also, because of traditional social norms, many of them didn't attend meetings. Those who attended rarely spoke up, and if they spoke, their opinions, they said, didn't carry weight. So if you share this picture, I've got this little line asking you, can you spot the women? So if you look closely at this meeting, you'll be able to see that the 2 women in red on the left-hand side with their heads covered. And this is what they told me, in one of the groups told me, that men don't stop us from speaking, but they do all the talking. So of course, I call this, I gave a term to this, called it participatory exclusions. And these participatory exclusions were quite widespread. But there were some exceptions. There were some mixed gender groups which had even 30 to 40% women. There were also examples of all women executive committees. Typically, this was because of historical or demographic factors, or because some local leader was gender sensitive and said there should be more women. But in most cases, this was not the case. So I had several questions. I traveled across India and Nepal for several months before I launched this research. And the questions were, would women's inclusion affect decisions on forest use? Would it lead to better conserved forests? Would women's class matter? And how many women would make how many women would you need to make a difference? Now, these questions, one could say, are in some senses foundational for effective environmental governance. And they were the central concern of my book, the Gender and Green Governance, which some of you may have seen. Now, this is based on a primary survey that I had conducted. What I basically wanted to do was I wanted to test whether the gender composition of the executive committee affected women's participation, rulemaking, rule violations, forest condition, and firewood and forest shortages. Now, my data relates to some 135 community forestry groups, and you can see here there were 3 districts in Nepal and 3 in Gujarat, which is in Western India. The way I selected my sample was based on the gender composition of the executive committee, which was the most important decision-making body. It was a stratified random sampling. In the case of Gujarat, it was 2 strata. There were 2 women or less, and executive committees with more than 2 women. And in the case of Nepal, I had these 2 categories plus 1 more category of all women's groups, which there were rather few in Gujarat. So the first thing I tested was whether there was a threshold effect, a critical mass needed for women to participate effectively in mixed gender groups. Now, the idea being that in the presence of other women, it helps individual women overcome social restrictions and personal reticence. So in fact, this question of critical mass has been discussed by a range of authors, but as you can note from this, even this short table, that in most cases, the focus has been on legislators and on political participation. These different people suggested different percentages, anything ranging from 15% to 40% as being effective. But this was not on the basis of actual, this was on the basis of observation rather than statistical measurement. Some suggested that 1/3 was a magic number. So I began as a skeptic, but when I tested it econometrically, I found that the likelihood of EC women in these forestry groups, of attending meetings, of speaking up and holding office was indeed significantly higher, with about 25 to 33% women. And that's where the critical mass lay. And just to illustrate, here is a graph which looks at critical mass on the likelihood of women holding office. And as you can see, if you look at this graph, that it begins to lift up and make a difference around 25 to 30%. It continues till about 50%, and then it slopes off. Of course, beyond the graphs, what do village women themselves say? And they also recognize that numbers matter. So, for instance, just to share 2, and this is quite common. I mean, I'm just sharing with you 2 observations, but these observations were quite common across the groups I interviewed. So there's a group in Gujarat who says it helps to have more women because then women will not be dominated or feel shy. After all, if there is only 1 woman and 10 men, how will she speak? And then there's another group in Nepal who said, I know a lot about the forest, but I'm scared to speak in front of so many men. If we were in a majority, we would speak in a meeting. I'm sure many of you, even those who've studied in the West, may remember that their mothers may have talked about it, of how small in numbers there were of women in mixed gender classrooms. I remember when I was an undergraduate in Cambridge, there were 10 women out of 150 students in classrooms. So this is not so long ago that you begin to see more gender balance even in other contexts. It's essentially, therefore, consider therefore that, okay, if you have a larger proportion of women versus if you don't, does it make a difference to conservation outcomes? Now, of course, as we know, especially if you're economists, we know that you have to actually control for other factors So if you want to see the effect of gender, then you need to control for other factors which could also affect forest condition. So I control for a range of things, caste and education of EC members, the method of protection, the size of the forest, the village characteristics, and so on. So that was one part of it. The other is that you might ask me, well, how do you actually assess the condition of a forest? And so I looked at changes in canopy cover and regeneration, but the assessments were also multifold. So there was one assessment which was made by the research team. Another was by asking villagers. The third was by assessing on the basis of forest department records. And then I also used satellite data, which was calibrated to the village level. So what did I find? So overall, firstly, even without gender, the majority of forests were showing an improvement simply by community protection. So here's a picture. So it's something like 83% of these groups reported improvement. But just to show it starkly, these are two pictures. They're taken by an NGO in this village, and the top picture is of the same village before protection started, and below you have after protection started. It's a slightly different, seasons. So it's partly a little bit of the effect of seasons, but it's not really that much, because as you can see here, barely rootstock is there, and here you have actually a young teak forest. This is an area where there's quite a lot of teak. So then the question is, okay, if there's improvement simply by communities protecting, is there an additional difference if there are more women in the management of these forests? And overall in India also, incidentally, between 1991 and 2001, the forest canopy increased by 3.6 million hectares, whereas it was decreasing rapidly prior to that. So the effect of gender then. Now my regression results show that an improvement was notably better in both Nepal and Gujarat. And in Nepal, I found that there was a 51% higher probability of improvement in forest canopy, despite starting with poorer and smaller forests compared to groups with men. And they also outperformed the latter with other indicators of forest regeneration. Similarly, in Gujarat, groups with more than 2 women showed significantly greater improvement than those with 2 women or less by most indicators, and by controlling for all the other factors as well. And I won't spend too much time on it, but this is just to show that there is a regression. If people are interested in that, they could look at my results in the book and articles. But I want to mention one particular result, that in one of the districts, I found that the effect was remarkably strong. So here, this was PANCHMAHAL district in Gujarat, and there was a 75% higher probability of improvement in forest canopy among groups which had more than 2 women, and did well by all indicators: much reduced degraded area and much improved forest change. So the question then obviously is that why did this particular district do so much better? So when I probed that, I found that not only did the groups have more women where they did better, but they had a larger proportion of landless women, of poorer women. And then it begins to make sense that landless women are the most forest dependent, and if they were not part of the decision-making body, then they would be much more hostile to forest closure. So when they were included in the executive committee, these women could persuade other landless women to comply with the rules, and they themselves followed the rules better as well. So you had a win-win in a way, that you had better conservation and more equal benefit sharing by gender and class. So an obvious question you will ask is, well, why did groups with more women perform better? And the first one is that it hugely improves protection. So here I'll just give you some quotations. Firstly, there was greater compliance with rules by the executive committee women themselves. So they quite frankly admitted that we now feel that the forest is ours, but when we were just the group members, but not in the executive committee, this woman says, I used to steal grass from the forest. But after becoming an EC member, I stopped stealing. The second thing they do is that they share information more with other women about the rules and persuade them not to cut branches. So again, they say qualitatively having women in the group helps, because often women would cut firewood from the protected forest when they needed it. Then we held a meeting and we stopped the cutting. And we also persuaded women from another village to stop cutting our forest. So here I want to, age also mattered. Here's a small patrol group of women who are going on an informal patrol, and they formed it themselves. And this is what they said, that the chair of that group said, I held a meeting with the women and we decided that some women would go together every day for patrolling. So this is an important part of the story of better patrolling and so on. But there are other factors. Women have a higher stake in keeping out intruders because they depend on forests much more. And then something which is very key in all our discussions today, even on biodiversity, that women have the village women's knowledge of plants and species and how do you ecologically extract products is not the same as men's knowledge. So typically there's actually quite a lot of, literature now that's grown, which shows that men have knowledge particularly of the items that they collect, which tend to be much more timber related, and women have much more knowledge of the items they collect. And because women collect such a vast diversity of plants and so on, and they know about extraction practices, they were able to make suggestions on forest improvement and regeneration, which the men had not thought about. So there are other factors also that if they were on the executive committee, their preferences would be taken into account. And there's some evidence to show that conflict resolution tends to be better among groups which have women, and there's anthropological as well as experimental games literature on this. So here's just a picture to show that, this is a woman in Nepal and she's extracting tree fodder, and it requires quite care and skill. When do you extract, how much do you extract so that it gets regenerated? So that's I think pretty important. So far I've talked to you about forest collectives, which, as I showed, that including women in the management of forests, whether it's all women's groups or executive committees or mixed gender executive committees, their presence has made a difference to conservation outcomes, and in reducing shortages of firewood. But this is a common pool resource. Forests are common pool resources. Now I want to talk to you about private property resources, which are farm collectives. Because unlike forests, which involve common pool resources, you don't actually have that much research on joint farming, where people cooperate around farmland. So why do we actually need farm collectives, you will say? Well, farmers cultivate with their families. Why do we need farm collectives? Now, perhaps the single most important reason is that increasingly, globally, farms are small in developing countries. 84% of farmers across 111 countries cultivate under 2 hectares. And by the way, this is not only developing countries, these also include some parts of Europe. So some farmers, in fact, don't even own the land that they cultivate. In addition, they face fragmentation, they face climate change, and you're facing a feminization of agriculture. So the question then is there an institutional solution? Some people have been arguing that small farmers actually should not be farming, they should be doing other jobs, and we should just do much more of industrial large-scale agriculture. But then they have no answer to where will all the farmers go in terms of livelihoods. So is there an alternative institutional solution to this? And I believe there could be in cooperation and group farming, which could provide an answer. Now, what do we mean by cooperation? Everybody uses, and often people use this word, but I think we need to clarify it, because cooperation can be at many levels. So here's to share with you that a cooperation there can be what I call single purpose cooperation. This is the most common form of cooperation in agriculture, which is that you market a product together. It's found in dairy farming in particular, and you find it in dairy farming in Europe, you find it in dairy farming in many parts of the world, and India has a very large Amul Dairy Cooperative, which has 3.6 million members. Large numbers of them are poor, and many of them are women. So here's a picture of the Amul, these two women taking the milk to the cooperative. Then you can have what I call medium level multi-purpose cooperation. So suppose you have joint crop planning across ecological zones, or you jointly purchase inputs or sell output together, but the cultivation is still individual. And the third is what I call fully integrated cooperation, which is group farming. And what this involves is that you pool your land, your labor, your capital, and you share costs and benefits. And these are the farm collectives where small owners can be bigger producers and non-owners could become producers. Now, conceptually, group farming can have many potential advantages. For a start, it can help increase farm size. It gives you scale economies. It can save on hired labor. It can bring a larger pool of funds and skills, and raise your bargaining power in markets and with government agencies. And particularly for women, it would also provide greater autonomy. It would give them control over output and an identity as a farmer, because women are often not recognized as farmers, they are recognized only as farm wives. And this is seldom possible in male-managed family farms, and where women's contributions, as we know, and as Alicia would know as well, that their contributions are made invisible. Also, women who want to farm, but they own very little land, can get land access through a group. As we saw in forest collectives, groups can help women overcome social restrictions as well in public interactions. So you might say, well, all that is fine in terms of concepts and theory, but what happens in practice? So in practice, in fact, what I call waves of farm collectives. So the history of group farming in some ways goes back a long way. And there have been at least 5 types of farm collectives. The oldest that we can think of usually is the socialist collectivization, which are best known but also infamous because it was forced top-down collectivization of peasant farms. And they had serious negative effects on output as well as welfare. But then in the 1960s, many countries gained independence from colonial rule across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And you find that farm cooperatives were then promoted under agrarian reform in these countries. And you can think of many examples from India, but there's also like in Tanzania, you had the Ujamaa initiative and so on. But again, they were supposed to be voluntary, but many cases there was also government pressure, and you found that big and small farmers were often asked to cooperate, which of course didn't work. The third kinds of examples you find are in Europe in 1960s. France, for instance, has I've been studying not just India, but also France and Romania for group farming. And then in the 1990s, you find very interestingly, in post-socialist countries, group farming developed. And it came up because people got decollectivization of land, then led to people getting small slivers of land, but not large enough for them to cultivate individually. There were shortages of machinery. So they pooled their resources, land and resources, and you find group farms emerging in countries as diverse as Romania, as East Germany, Kyrgyzstan, and Nicaragua. And then you have in the 2000s, the all-women groups, which have a very different model, which I will come to in a minute. Now, in the first 4 models, where were women in these collectives? Was there gender equality? In fact, there wasn't. So even if you take something like the USSR, and if you see this picture, which is a picture of men and women be equal, but the reality was that 85% of women employees relative to 66% of male employees were labeled unskilled. Only 0.8% of tractor drivers were women. So, when you think of women in Soviets, you have a very different image. But when you actually see who was handling the machinery, it wasn't the women. In China and also in Vietnam, women earned less work points than men, even for harder tasks. So you have gender differential in average work points in China in 1973 was 2.5. In India, the experiments in the 1960s and in many of the post-colonial countries, they were collectives of family farms. And here again, women didn't get a good deal because there was a traditional division of labor. They had limited autonomy and they were not seen as farmers in their own right. But in the 2000s, the farm collectives, which I have now studied, are quite different from all these other examples, because these are voluntarily constituted, they're egalitarian, they are small-sized, and they have been based on the adaptation of the self-help group model. And they are managed entirely by women outside the framework of family farms. Now, I examined these farm collectives run by women in 2 states of India, Andhra Pradesh and Kerala. But I'll focus on Kerala, which is on the southernmost part of India, and because it gives us special insights. And I have several papers on this, so people, I'll only do a broad brush sharing, but there are several papers if you want to read more in depth about the results. Now in Kerala, group enterprises in general, not just only group farming, were promoted by the state government under its state poverty eradication mission, the Kudumshri mission. And the idea of group farming actually came from village women themselves as an experiment of leasing land. But the program was then crafted and enlarged by senior government officials and intellectuals. And what the base was that at the village level, they had neighborhood groups, which were saving and credit groups. And members of those groups could then set up a group enterprise, including group farming. So today, if you can imagine, there are 68,000 women's group farms based on leasing in land and cultivating jointly. It's not 10 or 20 or 200, it's 68,000. So I decided that we need to actually test, are these group farms as productive as individual family farms? Are they as profitable? Because if they're not, then how would policy move forward? So what I did was I selected 2 districts for my study. And this is these are the 2 districts. This is Alappuzha and Thrissur. Alappuzha I selected because it's a paddy, a food crop dominated area, and Thrissur because it is dominated by a commercial crop, banana in particular. And in both districts, a lot of vegetables are also grown. I had a sample of some, and this is this is Kerala in vis-a-vis India, and this is the districts in Kerala. Now, my sample consisted of 250 farms. They were all women farms and individual family farms. And the individual family farms, 95% of them were male managed. Now, the data I collected was weekly data. I had a team of research staff and including local women. Because, Kerala has a high literacy rate. So you could actually have village women living in the villages with high levels of literacy who could actually be part of the research program. So weekly data was collected for every input and output, for every crop and plot for an entire year, 12 months. Weekly data. So it's a huge data set. And in addition, held informal discussions, focus group discussions with the groups and with individual farmers. Now, what is important is that the groups of the farm collectives were heterogeneous. They included women from various castes and religions, and poor as well as those just above the poverty line. And this heterogeneity goes against the common assumption that you have in collective action theory and the assumption by NGOs also that if you have homogeneous groups, it leads to better cooperation. So why did they go for heterogeneity? Well, partly because they wanted to root the groups in neighborhoods and to ensure leadership, but also heterogeneity provides you a wider band of social capital. And this is pretty important if you want to lease in land. And there were potential social divides, but they tried to overcome them by rotating meetings in different women's houses over a period. Now, these groups had access to subsidized credit through the agricultural bank, which is provided to all, which is all India. And they received state support in terms of some degree of technical training to help them overcome some of the gender biases. But the groups are small, 4 to 10 women. What was important is all of them were leasing in land compared to individual family farms who owned the land that they cultivated. So despite all this state support, you still had initial disadvantages that they faced. Firstly, if you depend on leased in land, it has high transaction costs and this insecurity of tenure. Then the leases are oral. So it prevents access from, because you can't prove you're a farmer if you have an oral lease, so you can't easily get government subsidies. And there are, of course, structurally embedded inequalities, gender inequalities in terms of access to land, inputs, extension services, and markets. And then importantly, they had little prior experience of farm management because, not everybody had, they would help on the family farm, but they were not managers of the farms. Typically, it was the male heads of households who were the managers. So despite these challenges, the question is, how did they actually perform? Which is comparing all women's group farms and principally male-managed individual family farms. So I was not clear, I was not anticipating what the results would be. And I found, in fact, that the groups performed strikingly well. So here's just a little sample, simple table. I won't present my regressions, but there's a simple table from which you can see that this is the annual value of output for group farms and individual family farms. And you find that this is 1.8 times higher than that for individual family farms. Then if you look at the annual returns, the net returns, which is after you deduct all the paid out costs, you find that in fact it is 5 times higher. The annual net returns per farm, but also annual net returns per hectare were also very much higher. So, and in terms of a major commercial crop, banana, in fact, the yields in the group farms are 1.6 times higher than the individual farms. So these results are supported by the regression analysis after you control for input use, labor, and other factors. And in the regressions, you find that when you shift from individual farms to women's group farms, it can increase annual output by 30%. The groups also, so both in terms of annual value of output as well as annual net returns, you find that the groups performed extremely well. And this is despite the fact that they were leasing in the land and so on. Now, interestingly, on bananas, India is a very important producer of bananas, and they were able to negotiate contracts with temples for niche banana varieties. And as a group, they were more able to deliver than it is possible with individual farmers. So there was another advantage of a group. So there are a number of statistical results around this, but let me share with you that there was another very important result of forming groups, and that was what I call capability expansion. They developed identities as farmers and were not seen as merely farm wives. So here's a quotation, this group, the women said, "Group farming has enriched our farming experience," and this is one of the lead women there. "I realized that I had good leadership qualities and could even manage the technical aspects of farming. Other women also listened to me carefully." They also became familiar with a wide range of public institutions. So they said before joining the group, we had no contacts with bank officials, agricultural officials, government officials, but after registering as a group farm, we could start a bank account, we could attend training classes, we could develop a good rapport with these officers. I mean, they did have bank accounts, but that didn't mean that they had a relationship or a familiarity with the officials themselves. But as managers of farms, they establish relationships of, of professional relationships with these institutions. And they also learn to negotiate in multiple markets. So if you're negotiating a land lease, they needed to know what the quality of the soil was, what kind of land that they were leasing in. If they went to input markets, they could assess the prices. They also report that they could make production decisions themselves and manage the farm. And they had greater voice and respect in families and in communities. Most importantly, it was very interesting. I found that they survived economically during COVID lockdown much better than individual family farms. In fact, out of some over 30,000 that were cultivating last year in the around February, March, 87% of them survived economically. So that's also very, very important. Now, this is, although Kerala has the most important and large-scale group farming, in fact, it has been also emerging in other parts of India, like in Western and Eastern India and Nepal. And here you find that these are like in Bihar, which is in Eastern India, it's much more feudal than Kerala. And here they were able to challenge feudal relations. They are economically more efficient if you form groups. The women have learned new skills of handling machinery. And interestingly, it has reduced also to some degree job search migration by youths. Of course, the scale of this is a very small scale at the moment, but it has the potential for growing. And again, these groups, I talked to them telephonically through the NGO who was motivating them. And again, they said they were much more food secure during COVID lockdown than individual family farmers. So, so let me then bring in some broad reflections. What have we learned about women's relationship with collectives from these forest and farm groups? Firstly, both forest and farm collectives have empowered disadvantaged rural women economically and socially. But interestingly, it's also empowered them politically because it has led many women from these collectives. They stand for local elections in the village council, and many of them have won that, which wasn't the case earlier. And the fact that it is heterogeneous collectives enhance the skill and leadership pool and also the social capital base. And this is an interesting result because it goes against the grain of collectives that we normally think about. Now, women's numbers matter in themselves, although strategic solidarity can improve effectiveness. So simply the power of numbers makes a difference. But if they also developed a greater consciousness, they were more strategic in their approach, then it could further improve effectiveness. But then there is a debate. Should we encourage all women's collectives or mixed gender collectives? So I want to just share this with you. What are the pros and cons as they emerge? Now, on the one hand, all women collectives do better in terms of cooperation and outcomes. And this was found in both forest collectives and farm collectives. And if you think back, if you also look at other collectives like self-help groups or microcredit, like the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, initially these initiatives were all open to men's and women. So you had, like in the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, you had men's groups and women's groups, and similarly self-help groups. But you find that now increasingly more than 90% are all female groups with excellent records. Cooperation is also found to work better among all women groups. Why is it? Because women are much more interdependent because of resource scarcity and because they all face restrictive social norms. So one can say there is a particular interest in working together as a group. And then rural activists also think that all women's groups are important for capacity building. So this is a very senior Nepalese grassroots worker who I cite. She says, when women join a separate group, they gradually lose their fear of making fools of themselves when speaking up. Women need their own small groups. This is what I know from my 22 years of experience. But And there is a but. So this is one side of the picture. But the other side of the picture is that men's groups have more economic resources and political power. So women's equal presence in men's groups is also needed. And mixed gender groups are also essential. So essentially, this is what I end up with, that yes, all women's groups are important in particular contexts, especially in the way that the Nepalese grassroots worker has talked about in terms of building their capabilities. But you also need women, you also need gender balance in other groups. Now, one question I'm always asked is, what about scaling up? So I want to share this different approach to scaling up. Scaling up doesn't mean that you have thousands and thousands of people in the same group. So this is much more of this idea of federations, that you can have small groups, small forest groups, small farm collectives and forest collectives, and you can have them horizontally, and then you can link them up vertically. So that at the local level, you're still interacting in small numbers and you trust each other, and therefore cooperation can work. But then you can have representatives and you can form a federation. And in fact, it's very interesting that in Nepal has actually a country level federation of forest user groups. And then finally, I wanted to say that women's collectives matter not just in terms of that being transformative, in terms of women's lives and the lives of their families, but also they contribute to larger goals. One can argue that collectives offer an alternative system of dealing with market and state failures. Women's role in forest collectives improve conservation, and that's a key element in climate change. Women's farm collectives increase output, and that's a key element in national food security. And then a larger goal could be that collectives can also help people transcend narrow self-interest and move to other regarding interest and collective responsibilities. And in fact, you have examples of self-help groups which have moved away from simply saving and credit to help non-members and the poor as well. They play an advocacy role. So, and I think this idea about moving away from self-interest to other regarding interest becomes very important when we are facing crises like the pandemics. Many people have talked about the need to transform food systems and other systems, to talk about shorter value chains, to talk about local communities cooperating. And I think for that, we also need to move away from the notion that is constantly embedded, especially in economics, in mainstream economics, that self-interest is the driving force of human behavior, to the recognition that people have multiple motivations, of which altruism is also an important part, and the shift to other regarding interest would be much more for the common good. So let me therefore end with these evocative lines by Pablo Neruda, a poet much loved across the world and Latin America. And this is from his poem, Residence on Earth, that advance in sweetness until the mosses take root in the thunder, until from the pulse of hand in hand, the roots descend. And the image that I share with you is in the same spirit. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Bina, and very nice to finish with Pablo Neruda. And I'm going to pass the microphone to Jacobo. So please, Jacobo.
Thank you, Dr. Girón. I will give a few comments. I think we agree that we are so honored to have Bina Agarwal here with us. The Professor Agarwal, it was a very, I have no words, I'm speechless. I think it was splendid. Thank you very much. I will just try to remark a few aspects of the presentation. I think some of them are very important for me, and other ones I think are important, but I have so many questions too, and I'm so excited, so please forgive me. Anyway.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I'd like just to start from this decision-making process, I think, is quite important. The participation of women, but not just women, is, in other words, you have mentioned this homogeneous economic situation, because you want to avoid this kind of imbalances. I'm speaking about intersectionality, because we can say, yes, women, but not all women are the same. Even in India, the diversity of the society, you can have religious diversity, you can have ethnic diversity, you can have caste diversity. So in this, I think it's one of the most important aspects, and I don't know, it's just how to achieve or to get to this not perfect but so egalitarian decision-making process. It's really important. And another aspect I think is quite interesting is this research gap you have observed. I mean, you're so right. We think that political and economic participation of women must be focused on political or parliamentary bodies, just that, like elections or this kind of representation is enough. But in this case, you go so local to the community and the local and even to some extent individual level, just to enlighten us and focus that it's not just this kind of political participation in the federal or the central level. It's the community level and the local level, which really, really matters. Sometimes we have to, I think, understand that. And I don't know, your research just somehow reminds me Gayatri Spivak's work about the subaltern, and specifically the woman, and in rural contexts. That's a really important, I think, in my opinion, aspect of your research. Not just this, I mean, urban contexts have a lot of problems, but the rural context is quite important, I think. And in India, in a country with a population, a large population, maybe the half of the population working in this kind of context is essential to know. Another aspect is the property. Property, well, in the case of the forest managing, is understandable. It's a common good, a forest. It's not a property of anybody, it's a property of all of us. But in the case of farming, I think that's a really important aspect too. Because even, well, in India, the case I know better, well, men, well, not so many men have enough amount of land. In the case of women, it's of course much worse. But even if in India you have these laws, and even you have this, we can say, attempts to improve the hereditary laws for women, it's not, the implementation is the problem, the social norms are the problem. It's quite difficult to try to fix this. But these self-help groups, I think, are quite an answer from the local to do that and to improve this, well, people. I'm not talking just about women, because even these self-help groups have important implications and repercussions for men too, because they can be,
Yes.
in other words, you mentioned actually that they are hired, or they, well, yes, they are hired, or they their lands, follows lands can be leased to, well, cultivate something, and they are very well paid, and even the product, the output, can be used for a grain fund. And this is a strategy from the local for food security and the utilization, which is
Yes.
one of the pillars of the food security. This is, I don't know, it's just so local, but so effective. And in my opinion, that's one of the most important aspects of it. Of course, the empowered participation of women, as I've told you, it's of paramount importance. But essentially, I think the mind-changing aspect, or the element I think is more vital, is try to improve the governance from the local level. Because, and as you told us, it's not about, this presentation is not just about women exclusion, it's about what women inclusion can do and why.
Yes.
And in this sense, I think this these insights to improve the governance in this community and local level are really, really vital. And I have been thinking about it, but it's just women, or empowering women's agency, is so important and will give so many benefits to the society in general. And you have illustrated this so well that I
Thank
am
you.
amazed, to be honest. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'm
No,
silent.
well, thank you for those remarks. And let me just say, be very brief in response, and then we can take wider questions. Firstly, you know, it is absolutely right that when we, you know, there has been so much lobbying for improving women, bringing more women into parliament, into legislatures, and so on. And that's quite right, because you can say that's important for equality in itself. It has intrinsic worth. But then we also need to ask, does their presence actually make a difference? Do they bring more bills to bear? And you often find it's not necessarily the case, that the women you bring into through political parties are not necessarily feminist either. So we need to actually ask, well, what is your agenda and what is your program, which is not very common. And therefore it has wider ramifications, that what is the outcome as well. I'm not saying gender equality isn't important in itself, but then we can ask other questions. I think the question you particularly mention is about the heterogeneity. That was, you know, you had several comments, and that's a very good question. You see, in the case of the forest collectives here, there is some degree of overlap, especially in South Asia, between forest-dependent communities and those communities being particularly tribal communities. And so in these groups, 80% or more were tribal communities. And therefore, the kind of issue of caste, in India, caste would be probably the most important apart from class, was less apparent. In the case of Nepal, caste was important, and I found that it did make a difference. But interestingly, the uppermost caste, the Brahmin caste, the women in any case didn't go to get firewood. So it didn't create the kind of elite capture idea that is dominant in social sciences and so on. It doesn't mean that the issues won't arise. They can arise, but they're not always the dominant issues. I also found that in many cases, the richer families said, well, we're not so interested in putting in time to protect the forest, and we have our own land. And so they didn't actually impede or interfere. But this could change if your forest is very valuable. Suppose it's very valuable, forest, these forests were not that valuable, but the very valuable forest, there could be a conflict. So we have to recognize that. In the Kerala groups, the farm collectives, there were people from different religions and castes. And the way they got over that was, there were instances when some of the upper caste women said, well, we're not going to have a meeting and have tea in the low caste women's members' house. And then the idea was, well, if you're not going to do that, do you really want to be part of the group? You have to choose. And that actually, over time, they adapted. And so I think economic self-interest can sometimes beat personal prejudice. Not always, and this is a longer conversation. But I think the heterogeneity helped was it expanded the social capital that the women had. in terms of their ability, because the people who have land are, often of upper caste. And caste problems are less dominant in Kerala. They're much more dominant in the other collectives that I was talking about in Bihar and so on. And forming a collective helped them actually confront feudalism. I just want to add that in Eastern India, the collective, there are all male collectives, mixed gender collectives, and all women collectives. So it's much more heterogeneous in terms of composition. And that also means that this is a model which could actually adapt in diverse contexts.
Okay.
So thank you very much. And there are a number of questions.
Yes.
Yes, there are some questions, and Elena is going to read them.
Yes, we have several questions on YouTube. Many people are congratulating you as well, first of all. And then Meenakshi Gopinath says, the movement from the village council to the negotiating table is in itself a fascinating trajectory. Thank you, Bina, for a most informative talk. Then Bina Pradam says, hi, Bina, very interesting presentation. I enjoyed it very much. It will be great if I can have access to your presentation. Lovely to see you. Then afterwards, Shilpa Vasavada says, wonderful, Bina, very good insights of impact of women in governance of forestry and group farming on private farms. Annalise Herrera says, amazing lecture. Thank you, Professor Bina. Then Kavita Chakravarti says, thank you, Professor Bina, for a wonderful and well-researched and in-depth presentation. Indira M says, very good, Professor Bina. Yes, we all know the rationality for the inclusion of women, but very little is explored about what is the impact of this inclusion on gender relations and also outcomes. Would you like to comment on that?
Okay, so I have talked about outcomes in terms of economic outcomes and capability, improvement. I talked about it in short form, but on gender relations, I only mentioned in passing because I said it improved their relationship within families and in communities. What is interesting, I'm sometimes asked, especially in the farm collectives, that doesn't it create some conflict? How do husbands respond to women setting up their own farms? It was an interesting question. And I found that, one of the methods that the women have, that if somebody is absent from work, they have to either have a replacement for that person or they have to pay a fine. And if you see who is replacing the women, so it's family members, daughters, but also sometimes sons and husbands replace the woman. So they see it as valuable. Part of the reason is that the family farms are quite small. So if women set up group farms, it actually increases the family income. And therefore, it leads to an improvement in gender relations within the family. And in the community, they say that they are now respected more. They have they are seen as farmers. They have autonomy as farmers. They have learned skills, and other women respect them too by asking them, if they are not part of the collective, could you tell us, what you know about organic farming, or what have you learned about new techniques and so on. So I'm saying it in brief because it's I've written about it in substantial length, especially in my Journal of Peasant Studies paper, which goes into more depth on questions of gender relations. I use Nancy Fraser's redistribution, recognition, and representation framework to explore it.
Bina, there are more questions, but I would like to make you one. How are you, or how will all these neoliberal reforms that Modi is implementing, how they will change this the economic structural and the gender, and how they will improve? Are they going to improve women, or or not, or what's your idea? What will happen with all this neoliberal? This is the way we are seeing outside, but I don't know, how do you see inside from the global south, especially in India? How are you seeing all these gaps between women and men? And also, one of the things that that I did, well, I was seeing some data of the care economy, the time use of women, and they are one of the worst in India, as I saw them in some statistics of the World Bank, and also in the statistics of the global gender gap of the Boss Forum. So I don't know how you are seeing this, and how will, and after all this COVID and pandemic, how they are being, what's happening right now?
You've asked me so many questions. It's a whole basket full of questions. I can't answer them all. But when you're talking about the reforms, are you talking about the farm laws that have been very much in the news in recent times? Is that what you're talking about, Alicia? Because, you know, neoliberal reforms can cover many things, and there isn't time to talk about that. But on the farm laws, you see, there are a few things that that could be said. Firstly, I don't think these farm laws will benefit the small farmers at all. Essentially, you know, there are 3 laws, and the first law is really sale in regulated markets. And the idea is that you can open it up, and you can also open up private markets outside the regulated markets. And so the government's argument is that you'll have much more freedom because you'll have a freedom of choice. But the fact is that unregulated markets are not small farmer friendly. The regulated markets, firstly, small farmers typically don't sell at the farm gate and to other players. So hardly 6 to 12% of small farmers even sell in the regulated market. A large number of small farmers don't produce enough surplus to be big players in the markets in any case. So the figures are very small. But even then, the small farmers in the regulated markets, at least they get information about inputs. They can sometimes get inputs on credit. They get information on technology. They think they get a fair price. Apart from the minimum support price, they get a fair price because there's an auction, and it's much more transparent. And also, if you have a regulated market space, then if you move into higher value products like vegetables and fruits and vegetables, you need cold storage. So it's possible to create that. If the state puts in money, it can create that. If you just open up the space, then the small players are just going to lose out. And the fear is, let me give you an analogy, that if you have a lot of private schools and you have government schools, somebody can answer that, well, it increases your choice. But what tends to happen is that the better off put their children into private schools, and the government schools then deteriorate and decline, because they don't get access to the same infrastructure, they don't get the same attention, the parents are not there to push the teachers to perform, and so on. So you get a decline. So when you have this kind of, that's an analogy, that you have private markets and then your regulated markets can go into a decline. Then there are contracts, there are other laws about contracts, and small farmers don't gain by contracts. They can gain if they form groups. So if you form farm collectives, they would be better able to negotiate. But as individual farmers, they're not able to do that. So I won't go into too much detail because one can talk about the farm laws for a long time. What's important is that women have been very much a part of the movements protesting the laws. There was, in fact, I wrote an article in one of the popular magazines because there was a remark by the in the law, there was a remark that women and children should be sent back from the protests. without recognizing that these are women farmers. I mean, these women have stake in the protest because they are affected by the farm laws. In fact, women are more affected because they are much more dependent on agriculture than men. What has happened is that it has really brought out very visibly the face of the woman farmer. Typically in family farms, they're invisibilized, but in these protests, you can actually see them in hundreds and hundreds, also driving tractors, by the way, as well. They will be affected, but I must say that the demand by women is not for land rights. I mean, the demand at this point is really joining the men against the laws. The Jacoba had raised the issue of women's land rights, and that's a complex and very important issue for women farmers. And what is often striking is that when women join protest movements, the demand for their rights in land is not very commonly raised. However, several of the people who have joined this seminar, including Shilpa and others, have been have played a very important role in India in trying to ensure that the laws are implemented. The time use data, you know, it's most care work is done by women. Is common. That burden has increased under COVID, except in middle class families, where you do have some information to show that men started sharing housework because domestic help was no longer available. But that was temporary because subsequent research data that's come out from another data set in August of last year shows that most of them have gone back to the previous patterns. So that's a social norm which is going to take a lot of time to change. And there are strong class dimensions, obviously, because if you're a well-off woman, then you can pass that burden on to domestic help, but also female domestic help.
Bina, it has been amazing, this conversation. I think.
Thank you. Are there any other comments that need to be very quickly asked?
There are more questions, but we are. I have, and Elena is going to say she's going to she prepared some words, and I think we have to continue with this conversation because I don't know. Well, we have a diplomado in Asian Studies. And we have a part of India, but we have to continue with this interchange because in India, even Jacobo has given us a course about India because he has been living there and he has just finished an article that it was published in the Indian Journal Review, and now he's preparing another about the financial system in India. But also, I think we have to continue with this conversation because we have learned a lot about the forest and the farm and all these things that not many people, even I didn't know how it is. How it is divided, this work, and all the collectiveness that it is in India. So I think this is just like a little taste of India. Perfect. But I think that we have to continue. I'm really very glad that you accept the invitation.
Thank you.
And also, maybe we can, I have a lot of ideas, but maybe we can have...
So we can do it, we can do an email exchange on that.
Yes, an email, and also we can have like we have to divide some talks, maybe 2, 3, to learn more about India. And if you, well, we will invite you, but we will think what will be the best way to learn more
let's talk about
India, and let's talk. Well, I will pass the microphone to Elena. Okay. Elena, please.
Yeah, there are so many ideas that are so suggestive, and especially if we think of Mexico, no, and the way in which some of these ideas can be implemented, or maybe they already are, I don't know, but that by communicating between countries such as India and Mexico, more and more can be achieved. No? It has been an honor, Bina, to have you here with us. You have aroused so much interest in many different channels, and we certainly look forward to continuing this collaboration and to expanding it. It has been very, very inspirational, and thank you to all the people who have been with us. We had in the different channels, several dozen people, at least 50 on our part, but we are going to see on the others. I'm sure that we reached quite a few number of people. And I remind our audience that the talks will remain there for future consultation. And hopefully at some point we will be able to have some Spanish subtitles so that non-English speakers in Mexico and other Spanish-speaking countries will be able to access them. Thank you, Jacobo, for such an insightful commentary. It was really interesting to hear your reaction. And yes, as Alicia was saying, I think there is so much that we would like to talk about with you. So let's look forward.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Kobo. And I didn't know you were writing about India as well, but those were really amazing comments, and you know, we need to carry forward the conversation, and of course you must get in touch when you're in India next, and you know, there will be a post-COVID time, and Alicia, it's been wonderful, and Anna, you know, to connect across through Zoom, through technology. It's like sitting and talking almost, and not quite, you can't smell the coffee I'm drinking, but but imagine, you know, Mexico, how many hours away it is, and yet we are here together. And Anna, thank you so much for your very patient and wonderful organizing and bringing all of us together.